I used to think that when my parents' marriage fell apart, it would be the divorce that hurt the most. The moment my dad walked out, the sound of the front door closing behind him, I thought that would be the hardest part. But I was wrong. The real pain didn't come in a single, dramatic moment. It came later, creeping in through the silence, settling in the spaces my father used to fill. It came in the way my mother moved around the house, lighter somehow, as if the weight of the past had been lifted from her shoulders. It came in the way she suddenly had somewhere to be, disappearing for hours at a time, returning home with a distant, almost dreamy look in her eyes. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just finding ways to distract herself, picking up new routines to avoid sitting alone in a house that still carried my father's ghost. But then the changes became harder to ignore. She started checking her phone more often, her fingers lingering over the screen before setting it down with a secretive little smile. Her mood had shifted, too. She was almost happy. I wanted to believe that was a good thing. That she deserved to move on, deserved to find joy in something again. But there was something unsettling about the way it all happened so fast. Divorce was supposed to break people, leave them raw and hollow. Yet here she was, already piecing herself back together as if the last 20 years of her life had been nothing more than a chapter she could easily close. That night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I could feel it, the weight of something unsaid pressing between us. She kept fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth, her hands restless. I knew she was building up to something, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. She had met someone. I barely heard the name that followed. It didn't matter. What mattered was the realization that everything was about to change. 2 weeks. That's how long it had been since the divorce was finalized. Just 2 weeks, and already, she was speaking about this man like he was more than a passing moment, more than a distraction. Like he was permanent. I felt sick. She kept talking, her voice carrying that same soft, dreamy quality I had noticed before. She said it was unexpected, but sometimes things just felt right. That she knew. How could she know? How could she be sure of anything after so little time? I sat there, my stomach twisting, trying to process it. But before I could even wrap my head around the idea of her dating again, she said something that made my entire body go cold. He was moving in. I didn't even know this man's face, hadn't heard his voice, yet he was about to step into our home, our life, as if he belonged here. The air felt too thick, the walls too close. I gripped the edge of the table, grounding myself as my mother explained that she wanted me to give him a chance. That he made her happy. That I might even like him if I just tried. But she didn't understand. It wasn't about whether he was a good person. It wasn't about whether he treated her well. It was about the fact that I wasn't ready. She had moved on, but I was still standing in the ruins of what our family used to be, trying to figure out how to exist inside them. And now, she was asking me to pretend that none of it mattered. To let someone new take up space in a home that still felt like it was missing pieces. I wanted to tell her no. That it wasn't fair. That she couldn't just erase what we had lost and replace it with something new. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. Because he was already coming. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The day he arrived, the house felt different. It wasn't the boxes stacked near the door or the unfamiliar scent that clung to the air, something clean and sharp, like cologne mixed with a hint of leather. It was the way my mother moved, the way she fussed over every little thing, making sure everything was perfect for his arrival. She had barely slept the night before, checking the guest room a dozen times, fluffing pillows, adjusting the angle of the picture frames, as if making the space look just right could make this transition easier. For her, at least. I stood by the staircase, arms crossed, watching as she rushed from one side of the house to the other, trying to disguise her nervous excitement. She wanted this to work. She wanted me to accept it. But she didn't understand that a stranger was about to walk through our front door and step into the life we had built without him. And then, the moment came. The front door swung open, and there he was. He wasn't what I had imagined. I had pictured someone older, someone who looked more like a man trying to rebuild his life after his own losses. But Adam didn't look like someone putting pieces back together, he looked like he had never been broken in the first place. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a relaxed confidence that made it seem as though he had always belonged, he stepped inside like he had been here 100 times before. His voice was deep, steady, warm in a way that made it clear he knew exactly how to talk to people, how to make them like him. I hated that. I hated how effortlessly he smiled at my mother, how easily she returned the gesture, as if this was just another normal day. As if he hadn't just crossed into our home and turned everything upside down. I lingered near the doorway, waiting for the inevitable moment when my mother would introduce us. When it finally came, he extended a hand, his grip firm but not too strong, the kind of handshake that was practiced, meant to assure people that he was trustworthy. I didn't trust him. I barely mumbled my name, barely acknowledged the look in his eyes, something that felt like quiet amusement, as if he had already expected me to be cold toward him. As if he thought it was temporary. It wasn't. The first few days with him in the house felt like an invasion. He wasn't loud, wasn't intrusive in an obvious way, but his presence lingered. He was everywhere. In the kitchen, pouring coffee into a mug that wasn't his. In the living room, flipping through channels like he belonged there. I could feel him in the hallways, could hear his voice drifting from behind closed doors, soft murmurs as he spoke to my mother late into the night. He was good at this. Too good. He knew how to settle in, how to slip into a routine that made it seem as if he had always been part of it. And my mother? She was happier than I had seen her in years. That was the part that made it worse. Because if he had been cruel, if he had been dismissive or selfish, it would have been easy to hate him. I wanted to hate him. But he wasn't. He was considerate, patient, never pushing, never forcing conversation with me unless I spoke first. He helped around the house, fixed things my mother had been meaning to repair for months. He noticed things, small things, things my father had never paid attention to. It made me sick. One night, I found him sitting in the kitchen, flipping through an old book my mother kept near the coffee maker. A habit of hers, reading random pages while waiting for the water to boil. I had never seen anyone else touch it. But there he was, comfortably turning the pages, like this house had already accepted him in a way that I never could. I wanted to ask him why. Why was he here? Why couldn't he find someone else, someone without a daughter who was still trying to piece together what was left of her family? Why did he have to choose us? But I didn't ask. I just stood there, gripping the back of the chair, feeling like I was the one who didn't belong. Because no matter how much I tried to ignore it, to deny it, I could feel it creeping in. The change. And the worst part? A part of me knew that I wouldn't be able to fight it forever. The first time I realized something was truly changing, it wasn't because of anything obvious. There was no single moment, no dramatic shift in the way I looked at him. It was something more insidious, creeping in quietly, unnoticed until it was too late. At first, I only felt it in the way I paid attention to him, not out of resentment or suspicion, but something else entirely. I noticed the way he moved through the house, the way his presence had started to feel less like an intrusion and more like a fixture, something permanent. I caught myself watching him without realizing it, how he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he existed in a space that had once felt broken and incomplete. It unsettled me. I told myself it was nothing. That I was simply adjusting, that after weeks of forcing myself to resist his presence, I had just given in. It was easier than fighting. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, as I was clearing the dinner table, he walked into the kitchen, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt before reaching for the dishes. It was a small thing, something so normal, but the sight of his forearms, strong, tanned, veins barely visible beneath his skin, made my breath hitch in a way that I hated. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I turned away quickly, scrubbing at a plate with more force than necessary, hoping the sound of running water would drown out the thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge. But then he spoke, his voice low, casual, almost like he wasn't really thinking about what he was saying. "You don't have to do all that alone, you know." I swallowed hard, focusing on the warmth of the water against my fingers. His words weren't unusual, he had always been like this, always offering to help, always trying to make things easier. But something about the moment felt different. The air between us felt heavier, charged in a way I didn't want to name. I mumbled something about being fine, not trusting myself to look at him. For the next few days, I tried to push it down, to pretend that nothing had changed. But the feeling only grew stronger, showing up in places I never expected. Like when he laughed at something my mother said, and I felt a strange pang in my chest, something almost like jealousy but not quite. Or when I walked into a room and caught him stretching after a workout, his muscles shifting under his shirt, and I had to force myself to look away. I hated myself for it. I hated the way my body betrayed me, how my thoughts drifted places they had no right to go. I started avoiding him more after that, spending more time in my room, making excuses to leave whenever he and my mother were in the same space. But it didn't help. It only made the awareness worse, turning every accidental glance, every stray interaction into something heavier, something I couldn't escape. And the worst part? I started to wonder if he noticed. There were moments, brief, fleeting, where I swore I caught him looking at me differently. Not in a way that was obvious, not in a way that crossed any lines, but in a way that made my stomach twist into knots. I told myself I was imagining it. That it was all in my head. That I was just a girl still struggling to adjust, looking for something to latch onto. But deep down, I knew. Something had shifted. And I wasn't sure if I could ever go back to the way things were before. I told myself I could control it. That if I ignored it long enough, the feeling would pass. But it didn't. It only grew stronger, creeping into my thoughts at the worst moments, turning small, insignificant things into something unbearable. The way his voice rumbled through the house, deep and steady. The way his presence lingered even when he wasn't in the room. The way I could tell when he was nearby just by the shift in the air. It had become a constant, a slow burn that I couldn't extinguish. At first, I fought it. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just reacting to the change, to the discomfort of having someone new in the house. That it was misplaced anger, a desperate attempt to fill the void my father left behind. But the excuses began to crumble the longer he stayed. Because it wasn't just in my head. It was real. It was happening. The way my pulse sped up whenever he walked past me in the hallway. The way my skin tingled if he brushed too close. The way I found myself watching him when he wasn't looking, studying the way his hands moved, the way his jaw clenched when he was deep in thought. It was a quiet obsession, a sickness I didn't want to name. And worst of all, I started to wonder if he noticed. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when I felt his eyes on me, lingering just a second too long before he looked away. Moments when our conversations stretched a little longer than they needed to, when the pauses between words became heavier, filled with something unspoken. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see. But deep down, I didn't think I was. The night it all came to a head, I hadn't planned for it. I hadn't even seen it coming. My mother had been talking about going out for weeks, some dinner with old friends she hadn't seen in years. She had been excited, glowing with anticipation as she picked out her dress, curling her hair in front of the mirror like a woman preparing for a new life. I had barely paid attention, too lost in my own tangled thoughts. But when she left, the silence that settled over the house was thick and suffocating. I tried to ignore it, tried to bury myself in the comfort of my room, but it didn't help. I was restless, too aware of the fact that he was still here, just one room away. I don't know what made me do it. I told myself I was just getting a drink, just passing through the living room on my way back upstairs. But the moment I stepped inside and saw him sitting there, stretched out in the chair, flipping through a book with a glass of something dark in his hand, I knew that wasn't true. He looked up when he heard me, and for a split second, everything inside me stopped. There was something different in his eyes, something quieter, deeper, like he had been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. I hesitated, hovering near the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs. I should have left. I should have turned around, walked away before the moment turned into something else. But I didn't. Instead, I crossed the room, slow, deliberate, every step bringing me closer to something I couldn't name. He watched me, silent, his expression unreadable. I sat down across from him, pretending that my skin wasn't burning, that my breath wasn't uneven, that I didn't feel the weight of his presence pressing against me like something tangible. The book in his hands had been abandoned now, set aside as if it no longer mattered. His focus was entirely on me. The air felt different, charged, heavier than before. It was a moment suspended in time, a delicate, fragile thing that could shatter at any second. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway, the slow rise and fall of his breath. I should have broken the silence. I should have said something, anything, to pull us both back to reality. But I didn't. Because for the first time, I let myself wonder. What if I stopped fighting it? What if, just for one night, I let it happen? I should have left. I should have stood up, walked back to my room, closed the door, and pretended that this night never happened. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, my hands resting on my lap, my breath shallow as I forced myself to meet his gaze. The room felt too warm, the air too thick, like something invisible was pressing against my skin, making it impossible to think straight. He hadn't moved, but something in his posture had changed. His shoulders weren't as relaxed as they had been moments ago, his grip on the glass in his hand just a little tighter. The dim light from the lamp cast shadows across his face, making the sharp angles of his jaw look even more defined. I knew what this was. And so did he. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt alive, crackling like the moments before a summer storm. I wanted him to say something, to break whatever this was before it got worse. But he didn't. He just watched me. And the worst part, I wanted him to. My pulse pounded in my ears as I shifted in my seat, my fingers gripping the fabric of my sweater like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I had spent so much time convincing myself that this feeling was one-sided, that whatever strange, twisted emotions had begun to surface inside me were my own burden to bear. But in that moment, I wasn't sure anymore. Because the way he was looking at me, it wasn't casual. It wasn't parental. It wasn't the way someone looks at a person they consider off-limits. It was something else entirely. A realization settled over me then, sharp and cold, cutting through the haze that had clouded my mind for weeks. If I stayed, I knew what would happen. I knew that this line, the one we had both been dancing around, pretending not to see, would finally be crossed. And once it was, there would be no going back. The weight of it settled deep in my stomach, twisting into something unrecognizable. I had to leave. I forced myself to stand, my knees weak as I pushed away from the couch. I could feel his eyes on me, the tension in the air tightening like a wire stretched too thin. My voice felt raw when I finally spoke, barely more than a whisper. I should go. I turned before he could answer, before I could see whatever expression had crossed his face. I needed to put distance between us, needed to get out of that room before the pull between us became something I couldn't resist. I had barely made it to the hallway when I heard my name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't commanding. But it stopped me in my tracks all the same. I closed my eyes, my hands curling into fists at my sides. I wanted to keep walking. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard it. But I couldn't. Slowly, hesitantly, I turned back. He was still sitting there, still watching me. But something had changed. His expression wasn't unreadable anymore. It wasn't careful or distant or neutral. It was hesitant. Conflicted. Like he was standing at the edge of something just as dangerous as I was. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This was it. This was the moment. I could step forward or I could walk away. And I knew, without a doubt, that whichever choice I made would change everything. Forever.